Alright guys, in this PowerPoint video we'll be looking at chapter 19. This is the expansion of Europe in the 18th century, and obviously we're not talking about the geographical expansion of Europe because that is pretty fixed, but more or less the expansion and growth of the population, the growth of agriculture, the growth and prosperity of the slave trade, and of industry as well. The legacy of the open field system. There are some things to keep in mind when we talk about the expansion of agriculture in the 18th century, and that is that most people lived in poverty and uncertainty. And both of those things stemmed from the fact that they were plagued with high taxes and ever-increasing rents imposed by their landlords. Most of these people were farmers, so you have an agricultural majority. Except for Holland, about 80% of Western Europeans drew their livelihoods from agriculture. And that was much higher in Eastern Europe, as we talked about in the last chapter, where men and women increasingly became bound to the land and in hereditary service to their landlords, or the system of serfdom. In most years, agricultural harvests were fine. They would have about 7 or 8 year streaks where the harvest produced enough food to feed people and their families, but usually every 8th or 9th year there would be a crisis year and people would have to resort to famine foods in order to eat and to feed their families, and that would be things like chestnuts or tree bark, dandelions, sometimes grass. These are things that they would eat in order to escape starvation, which led in these crisis years to an inadequate diet. And because of that inadequate diet, they had poor immune systems, which made them susceptible to diseases, mostly influenza and smallpox, which at the time did not have a cure. So these diseases were devastating to European populations. So what was the open field system? With the open field system, each manor or village usually had 2 or 3 large fields, about several hundred acres each, and they were divided into strips of land, and the individuals worked their strip of land, but it was done in common. The open field system developed in the Middle Ages, and the good thing about it was that it had successfully sustained the people living in Europe for many, many years. There were crisis years, but for the most part, it was successful. On the downside, it really did not produce any type of material abundance or surplus. So it didn't allow for population growth, but again, just sustained the people who were already living in Europe. To deal with the problem of field exhaustion or planting the same crops year after year after year, which as we know will strip the soil of its nutrients, peasants rotated crops. Also in practice, this was essentially a communal farming. The people worked the land. Even though they had their strips of land to work, they did this together. They held the surrounding woodlands in common. They maintained the open meadows. And even though, again, they had their own strips of land that they had to farm, this really was a community farm. In the age of absolutism and the growth of the nobility, the state and the landlords continued to levy heavy taxes and high rents on the peasants. And this, we know that this wasn't anything new, but it did continue to be a burden on the peasants who were working hard together to make this open field system work. As you probably gathered from the last 2 chapters we've talked about, social conditions were much better in Western Europe than they were in Eastern Europe. And this really mostly has to do with the serfdom that was ingrained in European culture at this point. In Western Europe, peasants were generally free from serfdom and sometimes even owned their own land that they could pass on to their children. The agricultural revolution. This really just has to do with the agricultural developments and tools that made farming easier and more prosperous for the peasants. Technological progress was really the only hope for improving peasant conditions. Peasant revolts, Europeans had learned, was not really a good idea because the social and political conditions that sustained these ruling elites were ancient and deeply rooted. And so they had powerful forces, armies, militaries ready to crush any type of peasant protest. So Europeans, especially the British, had gotten really good at rotating their crops and using new tools, especially the wheelless Dutch plow, in order to make farming effective. One of the interesting effects of these improvements in farming was that the surplus of crops created ideal animal food. And this led to more animals, which led to better diets for humans as they added a steady course of meat to their diets. And it also led to more manure, which made good fertilizer. We know fertilizer is made out of manure, which made it so that Europeans could grow more grain. These agricultural improvements made it so that peasants, for the first time in a long time, had surplus in crops and had many, many animals at their disposal. Advocates of the new crop rotations argued that agriculturalists needed to enclose and consolidate their scattered holdings into compact, fenced-in fields so that they could farm more effectively. This was known as the enclosure movement, and this meant a revolution in village life and organization, but it appeared to be a necessary evil of technical progress. This had devastating effects for the village poor and the peasants who had relied on this open field system or this community land or farm in order to produce food for their family. So as private farmers began to enclose or fence in their fields, it stripped peasants of their land. For a long time in Europe, the open field system or the old system of community farming and the enclosure movement, this new privately owned, fenced-in type of farming, coexisted. And this was because any time that a small landowner or a peasant could get away with protesting the enclosure movement, they did so. So both of these systems coexisted for a long time in Europe. All right, leadership of the Low Countries and England. The Dutch really took the lead on the agricultural revolution, and not just because they wanted a profit, but it was one of the most densely populated areas in Europe, so really they just had to get the maximum use out of their land in order to feed themselves and provide employment. So the Dutch were the first to use new farming methods, such as enclosing their fields or continuously rotating their crops, using all types of animal manure to improve their crops, and also just using a wide variety of crops. And all of those innovations were present in the Low Countries. Dutch agriculture was also highly specialized and commercialized. Specialized just means that they had farmers that would focus on a particular industry. So that might be like Christmas trees or potatoes or rice or corn or wheat. Specialized agriculture just means that you specialize in one thing. And of course, commercialized just means that they became very good at marketing and selling their crops for profit. So the English were also leaders of the agricultural revolution, and one of the ways that they were able to do that was by using Dutch methods, particularly with draining swamps and wetlands. The English actually invited the Dutch experts to come to England in the first half of the 17th century and help them drain some of their marshes, and they were able to convert swampy wilderness into thousands of acres of productive land. The English also had Jethro Tull to their credit, and he was an English inventor who just used the empirical method or the scientific method to improve farming. So he experimented with different types of animals, different types of drills in order to improve farming methods. And of course, he's known for inventing the seed drill, which distributed seeds systematically, evenly, and at the proper depth. The English also used selective breeding methods. And this is just simply getting your choice animals and allowing them to procreate rather than just letting all the animals mix in the same pen and just kind of randomly create offspring together. So by selectively breeding these animals, they were hoping to create a next generation of even better animals. By 1870, English farmers were producing about 300% more food than they had in 1700, even though the amount of workers had only increased by 14%. So this led Parliament to pass a series of acts that would put the enclosure movement into law. And so this pretty much led to estate agriculture and proletarianization, which is just the transformation of a large number of small peasant farmers into a landless, rural wage category. Even though the system was extremely profitable for England, it meant that by the early 19th century, a minority of wealthy landowners owned most of the land in England and leased their holdings to middle-sized farmers, who then relied on the landless laborers for their workforce. So not only was the small landowner deprived of his land, but the large farms required fewer laborers, which led to widespread unemployment. All right, obstacles to population growth. So until 1700, Europe experienced slow and uneven population growth most of the time, and it was irregular, which both reflected and determined the price and availability of food. The balance was achieved mostly through births and deaths, which balanced each other out, and also fertility and mortality. And because the balance was kept, the population most years grew at a modest rate of about 0.5 to 1%. And of course, there were abnormal years or tragic periods because of famine or epidemics or diseases or war where more people died than were born. And so the total population of Europe fell sharply, sometimes even catastrophically. But most years there was very, very small population growth. This chart is just a visual of the population growth that took place in several countries, but we're looking specifically at Western Europe, which is noted in this blue line. And you can see that until 1700, and I won't color over it because it would mess up the line, but looking at the blue line, from 1500 to 1700, there's just very, very slow but steady growth. And then you'll see it pick up from 1700 to 1800, and then it increases dramatically after 1800. So what was it that caused this dramatic population growth after 1750, but especially after 1800? And historians and scientists have boiled it down to a couple of things. One is that there was just an overall decline in mortality. Just less people were dying, and while there was an increase in birth rates too, it was just less people dying. And one of the reasons for that was the mysterious disappearance of the bubonic plague after 1720. Another one was improvements in water supply and sewage, which were frequently promoted by strong absolutist monarchs. But this just saw an overall improvement in public health. Another one was the drainage of swamps And this reduced Europe's large insect population, which diminished its role in spreading diseases. Good transportation, this made it so that crops could be transported across Europe. So if there was a place where they had crop failures one year, they could just simply import food from elsewhere, and it wasn't destructive to that community. And the last one is that there were just more nutritious foods available than there had been previously, which sustained the population growth. So all of these things together just, I guess, paved the way for massive population increase, especially after 1800.